For the final video of this course, I want to consider some of the future trajectories of the Episcopal Church and to think about what has been occurring in the 2010s with the church and what might that suggest about where the church is heading. I've thought of this in two ways. One is in the realm of race and racism and coming to terms with white supremacy. And there is in terms of reimagining what congregational life might look like. So for the first, this emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and how that is shaping the life of the Episcopal Church. So the 2010s saw this increased attention culturally in the United States to the problem of police violence against Black citizens. This coalesces or begins to galvanize in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the emergence of a Black Lives Matter movement. Now, that term had already been coined in the year 2013, Black Lives Matter, after the acquittal of the murderer of Trayvon Martin. There is a whole series of events of murder and violence towards Black citizens by policing forces. And Episcopal clergy become increasingly involved in the protests that occur first in Ferguson and then spread nationally over the course of the decade. One of the key aspects of this is the emerging role of protest chaplains or movement chaplains, clergy, not all Episcopalian obviously, who would be present at protests to offer pastoral care and support before, during, and after protests. The Reverend Kim Jackson of the Diocese of Atlanta, for the Episcopal Church, is certainly at the forefront of this movement. She was one of the protest chaplains in Ferguson. She's been a protest chaplain elsewhere nationally, and specifically in the Atlanta metro region. What is the role of clergy? And we're seeing a new way for clergy to be involved in the quest for racial justice that perhaps would look distinct from the movement we saw with escrew in the 1960s, or the conversations that clergy were having in the 1980s when we last visited this question of racial justice. Presiding Bishop Michael Curry is elected in 2015, and he makes racial reconciliation one of the core commitments for himself in leading the Episcopal Church. His commitment and his encouragement of the Episcopal Church as a whole to engage in this work leads to significant funding for racial justice work through General Convention, especially at the 2018 General Convention. One of the significant elements of that is the launching of the Becoming Beloved curriculum in 2020 and its use within local parishes, usually predominantly white parishes, working through how they as local communities will be accountable for justice and healing work on the local level. There's also an acceleration of dioceses, institutions, and parishes all coming to terms with legacies of racism in their past and seeking concrete ways to make amends for it. Reparations, if you will. Acts of repair. So for an diocesan example, the Diocese of Texas in early 2020 announces a series of racial justice initiatives with significant funding attached to them that the Bishop, Andy Doyle, acknowledges are a form of making reparations for past racial injustice. Scholarships are provided, community network grants are provided. There's a plan for ongoing accounting for racial injustice throughout the history of the diocese, and then making concrete steps going forward towards this vision of a beloved community. The University of the South, Sewanee, the theological school there, spearheads an effort at remembrance of racial injustice of its institution and offers an apology in 2020 for the institution being a repository, a leader of the lost cause neo-Confederate ideology of white supremacy for much of the 20th century. St. John's Episcopal Church in Montgomery, Alabama, investigates its own history. And one of the things it does is removes a pew that had been designated as the pew where Jefferson Davis sat in when he resided in Montgomery when it was the capital of the Confederacy. It removes the plaque stating this was the pew where he sat in. This pew had been sort of an object of veneration for some. It turns out that that whole story was invented in the early part of the 20th century and had no historical grounding, but that pew in its own way became an icon of lost cause ideology, of this neo-Confederate white supremacist remembering of an idealized past. And so we see these different ways in which the church seeks to reckon with its legacy and then seeks to make concrete amends to repair. Where the church is going to go next lays before us. And the challenges are laid out in a letter to the church that was written called Speaking of Freedom, that was published on July 4th, 2020, by Dean Kelly Brown Douglas of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. Canon Stephanie Spellers, who is the chief officer for dealing with racial justice work in the Episcopal Church as part of the presiding bishop staff. And the Reverend Winnie Fergees, who is at Trinity Church Wall Street in New York City and a leading advocate for justice work in the Episcopal Church. They set forth this narrative in a way that I've been giving to you, this recognition that the Episcopal Church has come to realize that in significant ways it's been shaped by white supremacy, by an assumption that cultures of whiteness are the preferred, default, better way of being church. And now that recognizes that as a sin and as a problem, what will the church do next? And so one quote they offer is this: whiteness prevents us all from living the truth of who we are as sacred children of God. White Americans must name and let go of the realities and privileges of whiteness, even as people of color must refuse the tantalizing pull to secure the privileges of whiteness for ourselves. So that really names the dilemma that the Episcopalians find themselves in, whether they're white American Episcopalians or Episcopalians who are people of color, of recognizing whiteness as this construct that distorts one's image in the likeness of God by elevating one group of people over another. It names, I think, part of the challenge for the Episcopal Church, in that the Episcopal Church has, in some ways, historically signaled a way of cultural superiority, that the Episcopal Church is an institution that represents cultural striving of when you've made it economically or socially. The Episcopal Church represents a class location and in some ways a racialized location of privilege. And that's a pull that exists both for white folks who might be attracted to that, but also for communities of color who have members who also are using the identity of whiteness in the Episcopal Church to differentiate themselves from some of the risks, perhaps, associated with belonging to communities of color. I think that's part of the challenge of whiteness that's named in this quote. There's another quote towards the end that is also worth reflecting on. Can denomination steeped in white supremacy turn and dedicate its life to dismantling the very structures of death that it blessed and built? Can it become beloved community? Will the flourishing of every person and all creations the hope of each? Where the oppressed are liberated from oppression, and oppressors are at last free of the sin that oppresses. This quote for me resonates with the history we've learned of the Episcopal Church, a church that in its origins in the Virginia colony blesses the institution of slavery and the disruption and dismantling of human dignity in the process. It names the problems of putting unity above justice and equity in the 19th century, and the dynamics of continuing to marginalize non-white communities throughout the 20th century. And this quote brings to mind the very observation that Dr. Martin Luther King offers in a letter from a Birmingham jail, that the sin of racism, the sin of white supremacy, oppresses everyone. It oppresses the oppressed and it oppresses the oppressor. This is what systems of sin do. So the challenge here is to recognize the system of sin in which the Episcopal Church is bound up in. And we're at a crucial moment of recognition. And this letter I read and its conclusion here is an encouragement for the Episcopal Church to take heart, to realize that its liberation rests in being the beloved community, which is to say, it rests in being the community of the body of Christ, a community of redemption, love, equity, and justice. So there's a question that lies before the church of what will it do next? Will it falter? Will it catch its breath? Will it push on? What this letter raised was a question of what will the church be next? And this is a question that lingers over the Episcopal Church in multiple ways. Another aspect of this is questions about how to be church for an emerging generation of seekers. There's emerged a pattern in the United States over the past 20, 30 years of younger generations disconnecting from Protestant evangelical culture and Roman Catholicism, who have turned to explore aspects of the Anglican tradition. Robert Webber in 1999 developed this category of speaking of an ancient future church, to argue how classic Christian tradition can be adapted to a postmodern context. That as some of the certainties of modernity fall away, people will want to grab onto the traditions of the past and see how it can be reshaped for dynamic ways for the future. And Weber argued that Anglicanism, which has this openness to both the past and the present, we see this in the ways it had dealt with modernity itself, is identified as a potential container for this kind of movement. Some have called it the emerging church movement, but there's different ways of conceptualizing it. What occurs is, as an expression of this movement, is something known as fresh expressions that begins first in the Church of England. And it is a way of asking, how do we be church in a secularized, postmodern context? How do we offer ways of worship, ways of belonging, ways of organizing that aren't just limited to the Sunday morning parish model? The challenge for the Episcopal Church then is this: how can it present the vitality of the Christian tradition when the formality and strangeness of its liturgy can be alienating for some? I don't know how many of you came to the Episcopal Church later in life, but there is certainly the very real possibility that a newcomer can enter the Episcopal Church, especially coming from a Protestant background or a non-Christian background, just simply secular background, and be lost, to not understand what's happening. Now, some people argue that being lost is part of the allure, that the strangeness and formality might be part of the allure. That might work for some, but there's also consistent narrations that show that this can also be a real blockage for others. So how do you provide space also for an openness for exploring what the Christian tradition might mean for exiles from other Christian communities where hierarchical cultures have been abusive. The Episcopal Church prides itself on being open to asking deep questions of Scripture, but it can also have a way of operating institutionally where questioning of the way things are done can be shut down very quickly. So the question is, both with these aspects of worship and aspects of ecclesial culture, is can the Episcopal Church recognize where its culture is not essential to the Christian tradition? To recognize the gift it holds and to offer that, and to realize places where that might be bound up with cultural assumptions and expressions. So can the Episcopal Church disentangle in a way, and I'm asking a question now of both the letter that Douglas and Spellers and Verghese offer, and that these purveyors of the Fresh Expressions movement offer, is to pull back and say, can the Episcopal Church disentangle its whiteness, its privilege, its complacencies, to speak to increasingly spiritually curious, mobile, and diverse population, while also discerning the essential gift of the Christian traditions that it has to offer? Again, this is a very important inflection point, I believe, for the life of the Episcopal Church. Where is it going to go? Where is it headed? Where are its greatest vulnerabilities and greatest opportunities? I hope you've enjoyed walking with me through all these videos. I hope that they have proved to be a useful resource for you.